Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, Beth Chats Books. Now today is going to be a mini wrap up. So I asked you guys in my last video how to organise books and me talking about books and wrap ups and things like that. And a lot of you suggested doing maybe 5 to 6 books as a mini wrap up. So I think I'm going to organise it that way. So I have roughly around that number of books to wrap up for you now. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So when we last spoke, I was reading The Confessions of Franny Langdon by Sarah Collins, which I have now finished. I was listening to it on an audio book that I took out from the library on the BarterHordes app. So I don't know whether that affected my reading. I really enjoyed the first section, particularly where Franny is living in paradise in Jamaica. I was really interested in how it went through her as a slave on the plantation, but how she was a house slave and a maid, and her relationship to her white owner. And then she moves to London, and she gets exchanged to another white man to live in their household. So there was quite a lot of drama that happened when she was in paradise. And there's this interesting subplot of the two main white men who she ends up living with are interested in experimenting with black people, and particularly with mixed race people and what they call albino black people, and trying to understand race. And obviously this book is set in the 1800s, I believe, so it's a very backwards way of looking at biology and race, particularly in our modern context. And the experimentation and the suggestion of that in this book is very uncomfortable reading. But that is a subplot that goes on. And then she meets Mr. and Mrs. Benham, who she ends up living with, and she ends up having a bit of a romantic relationship with Mrs. Benham. But we meet her at the beginning of the novel because Mr. and Mrs. Benham have died and she is on trial for their murder. And we go through that. So I don't want to say any more because obviously I don't want to spoil this plot. So this is a debut novel by Sarah Collins, and I think she has massive potential as a writer. Some parts of this were just beautiful to hear out loud. The audiobook really did certain paragraphs and segments of this book justice. It was very lyrical to be heard as opposed to on the page. It really enhanced the words that she had used. However, it was a very slow book. So on audio, it was roughly around 13 hours, 12 to 13 hours. So it was slow. And the payoff was very good at the end to find out and to tie all those loose ends together and to understand Franny as a character better. And I sympathised massively and connected with Franny and all the trials and tribulations that she went through. But the plot was a little bit too slow for me, especially on audio when I was trying to link this minor character to this situation, figure out where we were, and it does sometimes go back in time and forwards in time, and so it asks a lot of commitment from the reader, which I think in future books Sarah will really learn how to pace a little bit better. That was the only criticism I had. I really liked that there was a little bit of an LGBT storyline in here, which is a narrative that we don't really hear from this period of time, and it was interracial. There was lots of really interesting things going on in this book. I just personally think it was a little bit too long, so I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. And then the next book that I read is Who They Was by Gabrielle Krause, and I was sent a review copy of this from NetGalley and from the publisher Fourth Estate, who approved my NetGalley request. This book was longlisted for the Man Booker Prize this year, and we are aware of the final 6 on the shortlist for the Man Booker, and obviously this book didn't make it, but it did make it on the long list this year, so I did want to go and read this book. I particularly want to read most of the books off the long list and the shortlist this year for the Man Booker, because a lot of them are debuts, a lot of them are own voices narratives. There's a lot more diversity on it this year, so I really wanted to give it a go. And this book, I really wanted to see whether I would enjoy it. Now this book was very interesting for me because I have two different reactions to it. One is that I found it a little bit tedious, and the other is that I think it was doing something really important. So it's allowed my rating to sit at a 3.5 because I didn't have that gut love and I didn't have that gut hate which a lot of people have had with this book. So this is semi-autobiographical. This follows Gabriel, is obviously the author of this work, and it's meant to be about his experience about living in London and the culture there, the street culture, the drugs, the crime, and how he got indoctrinated into that world, how he had a life of crime in his younger years, how he went to prison. And it's basically a look at how people get into crime, and especially how we look at knife crime in London and we wonder, how does this happen? And he is living in a block of flats that is round the corner from some high-end areas in London, and it's juxtaposing those two different worlds and how they live side by side. That was really interesting for me. Reading this book really is important to help people understand why we have knife crime, why in particular London is really a big hotspot area for knife crime, for postcode crime, for gangs, and how the psychology of those relationships work. Gabriel did that beautifully, how he had a sense of loyalty to certain people, how there was a code on the streets, how weapons were used, how drugs were exchanged, and how that was a way of life. The only thing that let this book down is he did tend to repeat these scenarios. So we are seeing he steals from his parents, he bums at somebody else's flat, he takes a lot of drugs, he sleeps with a girl, he carries on doing that, he goes and steals from the wealthy, and then it repeats a little bit, so there's not really excessive plot development, but the relationships that he has in this book are what's fundamentally important, how they're established, how they're respected, how they evolve, and how he sees his place. And then also at the end a little bit of how he tries to extricate himself from this situation and remove himself from it, and how difficult that is. So it's really interesting. I also like the fact that this is a individual who has come from a Polish background, and I love the sections that dealt with his parents and his dad's sense of wanting his son to do better. And also how, in an interesting way, Gabriel, although he is white, seems to understand all the different races and ethnicities, and his vernacular in the book is very representative of other cultures as opposed to the predominantly white culture, of how he can interact, and he's almost like a social chameleon in that situation. He manages to get himself into all the different gangs and different scenarios, and he earns a lot of respect because he's willing to fight. So it's a really interesting culture that's displayed in this book, which I think is really important for a lot of people to read, just to help people be aware of how this world works, because there's a lot of ignorance, particularly with crime, and a lot of ignorance around socio-economic reasons for going into crime and poverty, and this book has a lot to offer, and it's incredibly relevant now. And I think he's a very exciting debut writer. I think the vernacular was really interesting, and the way it was written and structured was very fresh, and I think he will have a lot to offer in the future. So thank you so much, NetGalley, Fourth Estate, and obviously the author, for this wonderful work and for approving me to be able to read it. And then the next one I read was Our Little Cruelties by Liz Nugent. So this was approved on NetGalley as well, and this was approved by the publisher Penguin UK. And this is an interesting story, I will be honest with you. I was really interested in the structure, because what it went through is the three boys and their situations, their points of view. It would often go through the same memory or the same event, but from the different brothers' perspectives, which I really like when authors play around with the points of view like that and the perspectives. So this follows 3 boys, William, Brian and Luke. So William's the eldest, then Brian's the middle child, and then there's Luke. Will ends up being a director, producer for movies, for Irish movies, and ends up being quite successful. He has a daughter. And then Brian, the middle child, went into teaching for a while, moved to Paris, but then ends up coming back and becoming a manager to his youngest brother Luke. And then Luke is an Irish pop sensation who towards the end of the book is getting a bit washed up and forgotten and has a few drug and drink related issues. So the book starts with a funeral, and it's one of the brothers, and then we go through each of the brothers' perspectives and different events, and we go back in time and forward in time to understand who is the son that's died and what situations have led to this scenario. So I really like the different perspectives, but what I was struggling with is this was also very long-winded. So we were picking the carcass of events that weren't really that fundamental to what was going to ultimately be the twist at the end. So it was just indulging in these 3 brothers. I really like the character development, and I think using that style of raking through old memories from different perspectives and really going through their inner stories at different points really allowed us to connect with the characters, which I think was great. But in terms of it being a thriller, I don't think this has been marketed that great, because I don't think it really is a thriller. There's a little twist at the end, but this is more a slow burn profile of these 3 brothers, a psychological, intense look at their relationships to one another, but it doesn't have that thriller element. And ultimately towards the end, the boys got so embittered, all the brothers, that I stopped caring about what was happening to them. They were selfish and cruel to each other in different ways, and I wasn't concerned about either of them or any of them, or bothered about them and what they were going to do to themselves and their relationship to each other. So I could only give this around 3 stars, because while the writing is amazing, and I love Liz Nugent, I really loved Skin Deep. I gave that 5 stars. It was one of the best books that I'd read a few years back when I read it. This had a great concept. I just think the execution just limited it. It just couldn't go that much further. And once these brothers became as deplorable as they were, there was just not a lot of space to manoeuvre the novel, and you kind of lose interest as a reader. But yeah, it was very well written, and there were so many things that I did enjoy about this book, but just overall not a winner for me. So that's 3 out of 5 stars. But I would like to thank, obviously, Penguin and NetGalley for approving it, and for Liz Nugent. I think it wasn't her best work, but I will continue to read her books because I do think she is very, very talented. And the last one I want to talk about is Die Last by Tony Parsons. So my stepbrother's girlfriend lent me this, and this is actually the 4th in the DCI Wolf crime series. But I did quite enjoy it, so I am going back to starting the very first one, which I'm currently reading. So Die Last follows Wolf, and it is a story about people smuggling, and the novel starts with a lorry that is found in Chinatown in London with 12 women are found dead in it. So it's a refrigerated lorry, and maybe the driver didn't realise that it was for meat, fruit, whatever, to keep it preserved, and obviously human bodies cannot sustain that level of freezing without dying. So anyway, it's an abandoned lorry in Chinatown in London, and then Wolf has to figure out what's going on. So he goes through the sordid stories of immigrants coming into this country with no identity and going into prostitution. They keep referring, every time he keeps meeting these women, about wanting to become a nurse. So that is a bit of a clue to some of the plot points later on in the book, so I won't ruin that for you. But I thought this was really well done. It has that comfort, cosy read of a crime series that I really enjoy. So it didn't give me that lovely cuddle around the arms that Former and Strike books do. And I don't think it was as well written as the Will Dean's Dark Pines with Tuva Moodysson, who is one of my favourite crime protagonists as well, and I do need to get back to that. But it fills a really nice hole, because with the other books recently they were quite intense in theme, and this was just an enjoyable, indulgent, pleasant read. And so I raced through it. I think the angle on legal immigrants and people smuggling and trying to find identity in another country and asylum seekers is very relevant. And this book was written in 2017, so it's not really a new book. But I think it was done really respectfully, and it's aged quite well reading it now. I don't think there's anything particularly offensive in this book. I think it's just some easy, light read. So I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, and I'm currently reading the first one now, which is called The Murder Bag, and there's another 2 before I hit the one that I just read. But I think I'm going to go through the series at a leisurely pace because the library has them in and I'm quite enjoying it. So that's all the books that I'm reading. Like I said, I'm reading The Murder Bag. I am also now reading this Mourning Body by Tsitsi Mbaraga, and that I am reading on NetGalley. That got approved by Faber and Faber. So I'm currently about 40% into that. I have a few thoughts that are brewing at the moment, but obviously I will talk to you guys about them once I finish the book. I did see on Channel 4 News last night that they did an interview with the author, because obviously she'd had an arrest recently. She'd been arrested in Zimbabwe, her home country, due to peaceful protests. So she's a very interesting character, and I think with that lens this book is very interesting. But we will see, because I still have quite a way to go in the book, about how my final thoughts will settle on it. And I'm also listening to Gotta Get Through This on audiobook, which is a Louis Theroux autobiography, which I'm also really enjoying. Again, this is a very long audiobook. It's about 13 hours, which is surprising because I thought autobiographies would be shorter in some ways, because we've already got to the part where he starts working for television, so I thought we would kind of just start getting into the characters now that we know that he's interviewed, you know, the very famous individuals, or the infamous individuals, shall we say, that we now know from his successful documentaries, but we've not got there yet. And I know there is a mention at some point of Jimmy Savile in the audiobook, so I'll brace myself for that, but I am really enjoying that at the moment. So I'm up to date with the bookish reading that I've been doing, so I am planning to read a lot more NetGalley approved books. I have about 7 that have been approved, so I want to get through them because I always feel pressure to make sure that I'm buzzing about them and reviewing them while they're relevant now. And I obviously still have a lot of Ferocious Readers Only books to read, which I haven't forgotten about, but I will get to at some point. And I have Possession by A.S. Byatt coming this week, because that's our October pick for BarterHordes Bookclub. And I also want to read some cosy thrillers or October autumnal cosy mystery thriller vibes of what's going on in my head right now. So we'll see, but I'll catch you guys up on when I have next little pile of books that I have finished reading. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll be back very soon.